Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pentateuch, and you can see we have moved just west on Interstate 70. We're now at the junction of Interstates 15 and 70 near Cove Fort, Utah. Still more or less in the middle of nowhere, but a little closer to civilization, sort of. It's appropriate because we're going to continue our discussion of the diachronic research into the Pentateuch. We're going to especially talk about why did Wellhausen's proposal about the four sources of the Pentateuch, why was it questioned in the second half of the 20th century, and how did the Catholic Church respond to this theory? Indeed, it was somewhat of a turbulent reception. We're going to talk about both of those things today. Let's look at our agenda for today. First, we're going to look at what changed in scholarship. What made scholars question this neat four-source theory that Wellhausen proposed? We're also going to look at where is there continued consensus in scholarship and what matters have become disputed. And then we'll ask about what does the church think about all of this? How has the Magisterium intervened? We'll bring it home to life within the Catholic Church. So let's start with what changed. There's an old joke that says in 1570, everyone agreed on who wrote the Pentateuch, Moses. In 1970, everyone agreed on who wrote the Pentateuch, J.E.D. and P. But between those 2 years, and ever since 1970, it's been up in the air, and that's more true than false. As you can see on your slide here in front of you, since 1970, a number of objections have been raised, and you can see as you survey this slide, you can see that there's a number of different names who have intervened on this question. And I choose these names because I think they're representative of scholarship. I think they have something to offer to us. This is hardly an exhaustive study of the scholarship. That would take far too long, and it's just not worth all of our time. Long story short, the question of who wrote the Pentateuch, when and how, is a question that scholars go many rounds over. It's a topic that just never seems to die. I am going to draw your attention, though, really to two proposals. That of Joel Baden, who wrote in 2012, so this is still recent, a comprehensive study of the documentary hypothesis, in which he advocates the traditional four sources, but is a little bit more modest. His approach manages to avoid the disadvantages that Wellhausen fell into, and he's able, in my view, to persuasively respond to some of the criticisms raised to the documentary hypothesis. You'll also notice in our textbook for this class, Marvin Sweeney himself adopts four sources, but with some notable differences from what Wellhausen proposed. For example, Sweeney is going to say that E was written before J, and indeed he's going to hold that J knew the Deuteronomistic school. So, long story short, this discussion continues and it's not ending anytime soon. In my judgment, Baden makes a persuasive case when he says the following about the documentary hypothesis. I've got his conclusions summarized for you here on your screen. First, and in my judgment, most persuasively, the main criterion for distinguishing sources is how they present history in the narrative. Is the sequence in which events are narrated, is that sequence coherent? When things start to break down, like we saw in that story about how Joseph was sold into slavery, and we could come up with a number of other examples, that's when we're going to start proposing sources. Indeed, with the doublets, when there are differences, that introduces competing versions of the same event. And so we're going to propose different sources. We don't propose sources just because a given character goes by a different name. While that might be a good supporting detail, it's not going to support the thesis on its own. As Baden says, style, theme, and theology can act only as secondary criteria. You can see he has 6 other criteria that we're not going to go through now in the interest of time, but I think that his proposal is coherent. It explains why we need to do source critical analysis. Ultimately, it helps us understand that in Israel, there were multiple points of view. There was a northern point of view and a southern point of view. And indeed, there was a priestly point of view. There was a point of view that was more sympathetic to prophets. There was a point of view that was more sympathetic to King Josiah during his great religious reform. The versions of stories that we have are a product of the different tensions and the different forces in Israel's history. Ultimately, source critical analysis is helpful when it helps that history to come alive. When we can hear Israel's conversation with itself, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, of course, as it comes to understand its own history. Remember what I told you in our first class. The Pentateuch is Israel's vocation story. It's Israel articulating its relationship with its God. That's why this matters. So where are we today? Let's talk about the consensus that exists in scholarship today, as well as what remains in dispute. And again, this is my summary, my feel of the scholarship, which again, kind of can be all over the place. Almost all scholars agree that the Pentateuch had more than one author. Thus, almost all scholars reject the traditional Mosaic theory of authorship, at least in its most forceful version. And those who do hold out for unity, it's usually not an exegetical judgment. They're doing it for a priori doctrinal reasons. They're doing it because they read in the Gospel of John, and you can see an example on your screen here, alludes to Moses writing, and they believe that that text forces them to hold that Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch. For a number of reasons that we won't go into right now, that judgment does not bind us, and it ought not. Almost everyone agrees that the priestly source postdates the other sources. However, scholars are kind of all over the place on whether E existed as a separate source, and the relationship between J and D is still very much up in the air. Again, this is useful and fruitful for helping us to understand the different theological schools of thought that were prevalent in Israel. It's helpful for helping us understand how Israel understood its own heritage in the 8th through 4th centuries BC. But it's only so important. At the end of the day, our primary task is to interpret the final form of the Pentateuch, because that's what's divinely inspired. So that's what we're going to do. Let's now move on and talk a little bit about the Magisterium. What does the church think about all of this stuff that we've been talking about? And the first thing I'd like to mention is that the Magisterium has moved on this topic over the last 125 years. Facing the tensions of the modernist crisis in the late 19th and the first 2.5 to 3 decades of the 20th century, the Magisterium was hesitant to back away from the traditional Mosaic authorship. Indeed, in 1906, the Pontifical Biblical Commission issued a decree defending Mosaic authorship, which had disciplinary force within the church. It's since been relativized both in the late 1940s as well as in the 50s. Indeed, theologians, you'll notice I've got the name of ex-Cardinal Louis Bilot. Incidentally, he's an ex-cardinal because he ticked off Pius XI. That wasn't smart, but that's another story. In any case, there were theologians, reputable theologians, well into the 3rd decade of the 20th century that denied the existence of literary genres in the Bible. Now, Divino Afflante Spiritu overruled that, and of course the Magisterium has been very clear ever since then that no, we do have different literary genres within the Pentateuch, and we must interpret the text in accord with its ancient literary character, but all of that had to be wrestled through. Pius XII says something very interesting because he talks about these different modes of expression in his encyclical. What's notable is that the language he uses seems written to open the door to what Gunkel had proposed a few decades before. Gunkel, you'll remember, is the father of Old Testament form criticism, and what he was doing was saying a lot of these stories that we have in the earliest books of the Bible are legendary. But notice what he says: the legend is not a lie. Instead, it is a specific genre of literature. He's talking about Genesis here. The question of whether the accounts of Genesis are history or legend does not involve belief or unbelief, but simply better understanding. I propose that Gunkel was right. The church has continued to move along that path of better understanding, and we've been helped by things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like other archaeological findings, Neo-Assyrian records, which give us context, give us clues as to what literature was like in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. And so we're able to read what we find in the Pentateuch in that light. And so today, as Catholic interpreters of the Bible, we're trying to understand all that the Holy Spirit told us by means of a lot of complicated historical processes. And we do that when we try to understand those processes always a bit more. But there's more to studying the Bible than sources and history. In our next class, we'll look at the literary features, the literary artistry present in the text as we talk about synchronic analysis of the Pentateuch. Until then, read well and pray well.